Imagine that you are a farmer with a small plot of land. Being a responsible farmer, you only put 2 sheep on each acre of your farm. One of your neighbors suggests, why not take down the fences between your lands and allow everyone's sheep to graze in a larger pasture? With all that land, you could add 1 or 2 sheep to your herd, so you agree. The next year, you add more sheep to your flock, but so do all of your neighbors. Everyone makes a massive profit that year, but come spring, you find some of the grass has turned brown. The sheep bunch up in the areas that are still green, but soon too, those are overgrazed. Your flocks suffer and the land is ruined. You probably recognize this dilemma. Some of you may even know it by name. The tragedy of the commons. This social dilemma is a pervasive idea, seen in media, taught in classrooms, and used to justify policy decisions that affect the world you live in. When I began researching this topic, I thought I had a decent understanding of the tragedy of the commons, but my delusions of adequacy were short-lived. To better understand the tragedy of the commons, we need to understand where it came from, who developed it, and how it has affected the world. And what better place to start our journey than with a little-known economics professor. In 1833, at the University of Oxford, William Forster Lloyd presented 2 lectures on the checks to population. Lloyd warns that human population can grow much faster than the food supply needed to feed it. An idea originally conceived by economist Robert Malthus, which is now known as Malthusianism. He envisions a vicious cycle where people working in their own best interest will unwittingly bring about catastrophe shared by all. Through his lecture, Lloyd develops the concept that made him famous. Why are all the cattle on a common so puny and stunted? Why is the common itself so bare-worn and cropped so differently from the adjoining enclosures? If a person puts more cattle into his own field, the amount of the subsistence which they consume is all deducted from that which is at the command of his original stock. But if he puts more cattle on a common, the food which they consume forms a deduction which is shared between all the cattle, and only a small part of it is taken from his own cattle. Lloyd laid the foundation upon which the tragedy of the commons was built. Even the example he used persists to this day, of shared grazing lands used by livestock. Lloyd's work went largely unnoticed for 134 years until an American ecologist decided to do some writing. In 1968, Science magazine published an article that was wildly influential in the field of biology. It was so influential, in fact, that a major survey conducted in 2002 found it to be the most influential publication on the career of biologists. The title of this article? The Tragedy of the Commons, by one Garrett Hardin, who is problematic for a number of reasons, which I'll get into later, but for now, let's just pretend to be blissfully ignorant. Hardin cites the earlier works of William Floyd, Charles Darwin, and Robert Malthus to make his case, to paint a picture of why humanity is hurtling towards tragedy and what must be done to prevent that future from becoming reality. Hardin broadens the definition of the commons to include more than just a green space for livestock. Parking spaces, the fish of the oceans, nature preserves, the very air we breathe and the water we drink. All commons that we jointly share. Hardin draws a parallel between the problems of nuclear war and Malthusian population growth, both problems that he says have no technical solution. In part, what he's saying is you can't invent your way out of these problems with technology or clever strategies, but Hardin is also very clear to state that these are games with no win state. In regards to the game of tic-tac-toe, Hardin says this: I can only win by giving a radical meaning to the word win. I can hit my opponent over the head, or I can drug him, or I can falsify the records. Every way in which I win involves in some sense an abandonment of the game as we intuitively understand it. The subtitle of Hardin's article now reads a bit more ominously. The population problem has no technical solution. It requires a fundamental extension in morality. Now, to understand what Hardin's extensions of morality mean, we need to look no further than the solutions he proposes in his article, which largely revolve around Malthusian ideas to limit population growth. Or in Hardin's words, The most important aspect of necessity that we must now recognize is the necessity of abandoning the commons in breeding. No technical solution can rescue us from the misery of overpopulation. Freedom to breed will bring ruin to all. It is at this point that I feel it prudent to say that Hardin was not a good person. Though championed as an environmentalist, his works were often focused on the persecution of minorities, immigrants, and the poor. The Southern Poverty Law Center lists him as a white nationalist whose works were, quote, frank in their racism and quasi-fascist ethno-nationalism. Although ripe with racist and fascist ideas, Hardin's work left one big question unanswered. Was the tragedy of the commons truly without a solution? One woman dedicated her career to solving the unsolvable. 30 years after Garrett Hardin's debut, another article was published in the Science magazine, co-authored by Elinor Ostrom, a political economist and somebody who actually did field research. The article was titled, Revisiting the Commons, Local Lessons, Global Challenges. Ostrom offered a rebuttal to Hardin's conclusions. Although tragedies have undoubtedly occurred, it is also obvious that for thousands of years, people have self-organized to manage common pool resources, and users often do devise long-term, sustainable institutions for governing these resources. It is time for a reassessment of the generality of the theory that has grown out of Hardin's original paper. Where Hardin had made bold assertions about how people in the world worked, Ostrom actually went out and did research. From the Swiss Alps to farms in Nepal, Ostrom found countless examples where communities had not only successfully managed shared resources, but prospered for centuries for it. Elinor's research successfully disproved Hardin's conclusions. The tragedy of the commons was not inevitable. It was solvable. Ostrom discovered that humans aren't selfish maximizers all the time, and they will work together to help one another. It's a concept called reciprocity, where one individual helps another, it fosters a need to return the favor. And in the best scenarios, this creates a feedback loop, which builds an entire community of people, all dedicated to making sure everyone gets the best outcome. Ostrom's research overturned decades of scientific thought, and in 2009, she was awarded the Nobel Prize in Economic Science. The Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences noted that her work, quote, teaches us novel lessons about the deep mechanisms that sustain cooperation in human societies. Ostrom continued to write and lecture until she sadly passed away in 2012 at the age of 78. I didn't have any clue where this topic was going to take me when I started. I thought it might help me better frame some of the problems the world is facing, like climate change or inequality. Instead, I was reading through 200-year-old lecture notes and chasing down references on scientific papers. But to be honest, I'm not complaining. What seemed like a simple concept was literally centuries in the making. An analogy made back in 1833 was developed into a scientific field-defining paper 134 years later, though not for the most noble of intentions. It took a further 3 decades for that idea to be supplanted by actual research which tells us a whole new story of human cooperation. The tragedy of the commons isn't a story about how humans will inevitably destroy themselves. It isn't a story about how our selfish behaviors will spell disaster. The tragedy of the commons is a warning that we can do those terrible things. But it is also a reminder that we have the power to solve the unsolvable.